Welcome to an introduction to educational research. Today's video will deal with group experimental designs. By the way, if you have not already taken a look at the video of threats to internal and external validity, that would be a prerequisite for understanding the contents of this video. So if you haven't already seen that, then please look at that video first. That's internal and external validity. All right, well, here's our big picture. This is the types of educational research. You've seen this view before. The quantitative methodologies, the qualitative, and we are on the quantitative side and on the experimental side. And today's video is going to look at true experimental research designs, quasi-experimental research designs, and pre-experimental research designs. The validity of an experiment is a direct function of the degree to which the threats to internal and external validity, those variables, are controlled. So it's very important that the researcher try and control any threats to internal and external validity. If variables are not controlled, it's difficult to interpret the results or to be able to generalize the results, and that's the idea of doing research. And we've already discussed the term confound as referring to the interference of extraneous variables in an experiment. These are variables that supply alternative explanations for the results other than the treatment or the independent variable. So the researcher is very concerned with trying to control for extraneous variables. Good designs, good research designs control for these compounds or the threats to internal or external validity. Poor designs do not. By far, the best way to control for confounds is to have randomization, random selection of a sample out of a population, and then from that randomly selected sample, randomly assigning them to the experimental group or the control group. That controls for almost all variables or all threats to internal and external validity. So this video is going to address pre-experimental designs, the one-shot case study design, one-group pre-test, post-test design, and a static group comparison design, and quasi-experimental non-equivalent control group, time series, and counterbalance design. And then true experimental designs. And again, the hallmark of true experimental designs is random assignment and manipulation of the independent variable or the treatment. So the researcher is able to randomly select a group of participants from a population. So randomly select a sample, and then from that randomly selected sample, randomly assign individuals to treatment or control groups. And the other characteristic is the manipulation of the independent variable, deciding who goes in. This is the control group and this is the experimental group. Well, okay, so let's take a look at some designs here now. These are pre-experimental designs, and by the way, this is the reference where this information comes from Gay's book on educational research. Now, let's just take a look at these symbols for a minute up here. Treatment 1 is usually, this is an unusual treatment or the intervention. This is usually the intervention. Treatment 2 would be the control group. So if you see down here treatment 1, you know this is an intervention, and treatment 1, this is an intervention. Treatment 1 here means that's an intervention, this is a control group. And then pre-test or post-test, we know what those are. Now, if a threat to internal validity is controlled for, the box next to it will be green. If a threat to internal validity is not controlled for because it's not relevant, it's irrelevant to the research, it'll be black. And if a threat to internal validity is not controlled for, period, then it will be a red box. And this will make a lot more sense to you in a minute. Okay, so we're going to look at first a one-shot case study. So one-shot case study involves a single group that is exposed to a treatment. So you see treatment 1, and then is post-tested. So it's a treatment and post-test. In this design, none of the threats to internal validity are controlled for. There are a bunch of threats that are irrelevant, like testing, instrumentation, regression, differential selection, selection interaction, and both of the threats to external validity. Those are irrelevant. But the threats that are relevant, history, maturation, and mortality, are not controlled for in this design. So by these threats not being controlled for, even if participants score high on the post-test, so we have a treatment and then we test. Even if the participants score high in the post-test, we cannot attribute their performance to the treatment or the independent variable, since we don't know what they knew before undergoing the treatment. So there was no pre-test, there was just a treatment, so we don't know what they may have already known, the information that has been presented in. And then on the post-test, they just show what they have known. So, and the other thing is, history becomes a threat because, let's say the treatment lasts 2 months. Well, some kind of historical, some kind of event that is outside of the treatment could have taken place, like the flu or whatever it was that we talked about. The other thing, students have different developmental levels and maturation levels, so maturation might become a part. And mortality could become a part. Participants could have dropped out in some systematic way. Maybe some were bored, maybe some felt the treatment was too difficult. And so mortality or attrition could present a threat. So this is a very weak design. Rarely is it used, although it might be used in a classroom just to test out an idea, to see if the idea has any promise. But it's a very poor design. Now, the one group pre-test and post-test design. So in this design, there's a pre-test, then there's a treatment, and then a post-test. So it's a single group that's pre-tested, exposed to a treatment, and then post-tested. Now, the success of the treatment is determined by comparing the pre-test and post-test scores. Well, this design controls for some threats to internal and external validity, not controlled for by the first one, the one-shot case study, but a number of additional factors relevant to this design are not controlled for. If participants do significantly better on the post-test than on the pre-test, it cannot be assumed that the treatment or the independent variable was the reason for that improvement. History and maturation are not controlled for, as you see here by the red boxes. Something significant could happen either during the length of the research, which would be a historical threat, or there could be some kind of differential maturational levels within the class group. These could affect the results. The threats of testing and instrumentation are also not controlled for. Participants could have learned something during the pre-test that affected their post-test scores, or maybe the pre-test and post-test were not equated properly. One may have been easier or more difficult. Also, statistical regression presents a threat. These are the tendencies of the scores to head towards the mean. It's possible that participants did extremely poorly just by dumb luck, let's say, on the pretest, and then did their normal performance, which would have been an improvement over the pretest on the post-test. So we cannot ascribe the differences, the gain, necessarily due to the independent variable. Differential selection is irrelevant here. Mortality is controlled for. Selection interaction is irrelevant. And pretest and treatment interaction is not controlled for. We have a pretest, and of course the question becomes, does that influence, if students have a pretest, does that influence their performance during the treatment phase? So this design is also, there are many variables that are not, many threats to internal validity and external validity not controlled for. And so it becomes a very weak design also. Now the third pre-experimental design is the static group comparison design. This involves two groups, one that receives a new or experimental treatment and the other receives the traditional. So we have a treatment and then a post-test. And this is the control group, so they get the traditional and a post-test. And both groups obviously are post-tested. Instead of the typical control and experimental groups, these groups are more appropriately referred to as comparison groups, since each really serves as a comparison for the other. Let's see how this goes. Each group receives some form of the independent variable. As an example, if the independent variable is the type of drill in practice, the experimental or the treatment group might receive computer-assisted instruction, let's say, and practice and drill in practice, and the control group might receive a worksheet drill in practice. The purpose of the control group, treatment 2 here, is to indicate what the performance of the experimental group would have been if it had not received the treatment. However, the purpose is fulfilled only, and here's a major thing, only if the two groups were equivalent. It's extremely important in this design that the two groups be equivalent, because there is no pretest, so we have no pretest information on the group. So if the groups are not equivalent, then our results will be very shaky. In this design, participants are not randomly assigned to groups, and since there is no pretest data, it's difficult to determine just how equivalent the groups were. Therefore, it's possible that post-test differences, if there are differences in the post-test, those differences may be due to initial group differences in maturational level and also in selection. That's a threat here also, differential selection. One group may be a group of gifted students, one group may be a group of average students. So they're not equivalent and we cannot compare them. Mortality and attrition, mortality or attrition can be a problem also, since if we lose participants from the study, we have no information regarding what we have lost because we don't have any pre-test data. On the other hand, the presence of a comparison group does control for historical threats, because it's assumed that if any outside events took place during the history of the research, it would have affected both groups. So history is accounted for. Although this design has many, many limitations, it is occasionally used in a preliminary or exploratory study before launching into a much larger study. So these three are examples of pre-experimental designs. Generally very weak. You can see they control for almost nothing in terms of internal and external validity. But the static group comparison does have some utility if you're interested in just exploring an idea. Let's take a look at true experimental designs. Now, our symbols are exactly the same, except we have RA over here, which means random assignment. So our first true experimental design, we have pre-test, post-test control group design. We have random assignment. That's very, very important. That's what makes this true experimental. Random assignment to groups, a control and an experimental group, and then we have a pre-test, a treatment or an intervention, and a post-test. Now you can see that this design with random assignment, pre-test, treatment, post-test controls for almost every, it does control for every threat of internal validity. And the multiple treatment interference is irrelevant, but it does not control for, in terms of external validity, the pre-test treatment interaction. So what kind students were pre-tested, and that pre-test influenced their scores. But this is a very strong design, because of the random assignment, which makes it true experimental. Here is the second. We have a post-test only control group. We have random assignment and an intervention and a post-test. Random assignment, and this would be the traditional, the control group, and a post-test. So we have random assignments, treatment and control group, and post-testing. And you can see that this controls for almost everything except mortality. So if participants left the group, we would not know what characteristics they had because we have no pretest data, and that possibly could influence the results. But this is a very, very strong design also. And finally, in the true experimental, we have what's called the Solomon four-group design. Notice there are 4 groups, and we have random assignment in all of them. That's what makes it true experimental. So we have random assignment, and we pre-test. We have a treatment, and we post-test. We have random assignment, we pre-test. This is a control group, so there's no treatment, and we post-test. We have random assignment, no pre-test. We have a treatment and a post-test. Random assignment, no pre-test. Control group, so no intervention, and a post-test. And you can see that this design, very, very powerful. This design controls for all threats, all relevant threats to internal and external validity. Multiple treatment interference is not relevant, so it's not controlled for, but it's not unimportant here. So these are 3 true experimental designs. And now we'll take a look at the quasi-experimental designs. Now notice no random assignment here, no random assignment, so they're not true experimental. Okay, so generally when doing research in schools, it's not possible to randomly assign individual participants to groups because we have classrooms and rarely can you break up a classroom. So in these cases, we generally use intact classrooms, and then we can randomly assign classrooms, but we can't randomly assign students. When this occurs, there are still a number of designs that provide adequate control of sources of invalidity. These designs are referred to as the quasi-experimental designs, and we'll look at 3 of them. So the first is a non-equivalent control group design. In this design, we have a pre-test, a treatment, and a post-test. The non-equivalent control group design involves random assignment of intact groups, intact classrooms, not individuals. 2 or more treatment groups are pre-tested, administered a treatment, and then post-tested. As an example, suppose a school volunteered 6 intact classrooms to participate in a study. 3 of these classrooms can be randomly assigned to the experimental group and 3 to the control group. However, the inability to randomly assign individuals to treatment opens up threats to internal and external validity. And let's take a look at them. So we have a threat, a regression, which is the scores tend to move towards the mean. Since we didn't have any random assignment, we do not know what the groups were like, whether they were equivalent or not. We have selection, interaction, and we have pretest treatment interaction. Since there's a pretest, it may affect the results of the treatment. Although not all threats to internal and external validity are controlled for, this design, if it is dealing with groups that are equivalent in the variables under investigation, can be quite useful in applied settings such as classrooms. So even though it doesn't control for all of the variables, if the groups were equivalent, then this design has some utility. The next one is the next quasi-experimental one is the time series design. And here we have a series of pretests, a treatment, and then a series of post-tests. If the group scores in the pretest tend to level out, tend to stabilize in terms of their level and their trend, we can assume that they've reached the natural level. And if there is no intervention that takes place, no treatment, they're going to remain there. If the group receiving the treatment scores significantly better on the post-test, we can be more confident that it was the treatment. And let's take a look at the threats that this deals with. Well, it does not deal with historical threats or instrumentation. So events could take place between the last pretest and the first post-test. The treatment would be the history of the research, and events could take place during that time, which would present a historical threat. Instrumentation could become a problem also, because are the pretests and post-tests equivalent? Are they equal? And finally, you have the pretest treatment interaction. If taking a pretest might affect how one performs under treatment, what about taking a bunch of pretests? That might interfere also. So time series is a very good design, and of course it's not random assignment or anything like that, but it does control for many of the threats to internal and external validity. The final design is the counterbalance design. In this design, all groups receive all treatments, but in a different or counterbalanced order. So look here, we have treatment 1 and we have a test. This group gets treatment 1 and a test, treatment 2 and a test, treatment 3 and a test. This group gets treatment 3 and a test, treatment 1 and a test, treatment 2 and a test, and this group gets treatment 2, then a test, treatment 3 and a test, and treatment 1 and a test. So the treatments are counterbalanced across the groups. This kind of design is well suited when intact groups of participants must be used and pretesting is not a viable option. This design is very susceptible to the threat of multiple treatment interference because each group is receiving multiple treatments. And there must be an equal number of groups and an equal number of treatments. And let's take a look at this. But this design does address many of the threats to internal validity. And one threat to external validity is irrelevant, and then the multiple treatment interference, obviously it doesn't address that. So those are the quasi-experimental. So this particular video wanted to just give you an overview of pre-experimental research designs, true experimental research designs, and quasi-experimental research designs. It's not critical that you remember all of these designs and exactly what they control for or not control for, but since you're going to be reading literature research literature, it is important that you're aware of what kind of designs the researchers are using and what are some of the limitations of those designs. These are the resources, and thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.